Good to go.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. This is the June meeting for the Governor's Task Force on Broadband Access. I'm Brittany Beyer, the Chair of the Task Force and Executive Director of Grow North Regional Economic Development Corporation. As the task force members are well aware, we're really in the throes of grant writing and making sure that we understand what the recommendations are. So we're going to spend the majority of the time doing that. I'm going to hand it back over to Jaren to do roll call, and then we're going to get quickly into the meat of the work we had. We did one session, an extra session just 2 weeks ago, where we went through the policy items that came up in recommendations, and now we're going to do the next two. So I'll hand it back to Jaren for roll call.
Thanks, Brittany. Great to see everyone, and thanks for attending. Really appreciate it. As Brittany said, this is the Governor's Task Force on Broadband Access, and today is June 8th. A meeting agenda is available on the PSC Commission website on the events calendar, and I would just like to remind everyone that this is, of course, a public meeting that is being recorded. As we all know, in an effort to maintain the audio quality, if you could just mute yourself when you're not speaking, that would be fantastic. Of course, feel free to unmute if you would like to say something. Any members of the public, we do have a public comment portion at the end of the agenda. I'm going to now do roll call of the task force members. So if you could just let me know when your name is called, if you're here, that would be great. Brittany Beyer.
Here.
Marta Beckdahl.
Here.
Tom Boron.
Here.
Chad Young. Jean Pauck.
Here.
Celeste Flynn.
Here.
Rachel Shemlin.
Here.
Brett Shupner. Jose Martinez.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. Chris Meyer. Chet Strebe.
Here.
Chris Herjong. Emily Dittmar.
Here.
Jennifer Schilling. Andy Faust.
Here.
Matthew Gabriels. Robert Earl Baker. Lori Collins.
Present.
Gail Hike.
Here.
Shannon Clark. Sal Carranza. Justin Hebner. Oh, I see a Sal.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Justin Hebner. Douglas Cox. State Representative Beth Myers. State Representative Jeff Mursaw. State Senator Howard Markline.
Katie Prangy here on his behalf. Thanks.
Thank you. State Senator Brad Paff.
Dave Groshek here on his behalf. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to repeat a few of the folks I didn't hear from just to make sure that anyone didn't join. Chad Young. Brett Shupner. Chris Meyer. Chris Herjong. Jennifer Schilling. Matthew Gabriels. Robert Earl Baker III. Shannon Clark. Justin Hebner. Douglas Cox. State Rep Beth Myers. And State Rep Jeffrey Mursaw. Is there anyone that I missed or didn't call? All right, I think we've got roll call complete. I will turn it back over to you, Brittany.
Great, thanks, Jaren. I'm actually quickly going to turn it over to Kristen because she's going to facilitate the next parts of this. Again, thank you so much to all of the task force members for all the conversations, the recommendations, the homework, the thinking on this issue, as we're getting closer and closer to this. It's an interesting time. Again, I feel like the first task force reports was in a changing landscape. This time is no different in the fact that all of the resources are still maturing. We're watching how IJA or the bill is going to influence all of what we're doing, but I think our focus on the community and the active network building that is essential in making sure that it gets to all the ends of Wisconsin is really spot on for understanding how complex this issue is. But we really need to start narrowing down. We're still going to get meat from you. The conversation last week or 2 weeks ago was really beneficial. So again, I'm just going to turn it over to Kristen to facilitate for most of this time. And just a reminder, we have been meeting from 1 to 3, but we're going to be meeting for 3 hours from 1 to 4. So if you have to drop off, that's okay. We just felt like we needed to give more time to these recommendations. So to you, Kristen.
Thank you, Brittany, and thank you, Jaren. And for everyone that is participating or listening in today, it's a good day to be sitting in front of a computer from where I'm at because it's raining outside. So we do have this longer meeting today, and our time together will be structured in 1.5 hour blocks. The first 90 minutes of our time together, what's remaining of the 90 minutes, we'll focus on discussing the recommendations around network. Then we'll take a 5 to 10 minute break to stretch our legs and refresh our coffee cups. And after that, we'll come back together and we will discuss resources and the recommendations around resources. There are 2 Google documents that are almost identical to the documents that you received in your agenda packet. These, I think, are oriented landscape instead of portrait, which is the only significant difference between the 2. But I've dropped the first link to that into the chat box. I used a tiny URL, so it's tinyurl.com/G, capital T, capital F, capital B, capital N network, Governor's Task Force Broadband Network. And I'll give everyone a few minutes to navigate over to that. If you are unable to navigate to that Google document because of whatever settings you have on your computers at your workplaces, you can open up and follow along on the Word document that was sent in the agenda packet. A couple of us, while we're having our discussion today, will be keeping notes on this document. For those of you that are watching, our Google documents are temporary workspaces. We download them at the end of each meeting and preserve them for public record. And those will be held at the PSC and available for viewing for those that would wish to view them. The document then at some point between now and tomorrow will be taken down off of Google Drive so that we have the correct material preserved at the end of the day today. So both of our documents, we'll have a second document in our second session. So for this first 90 minutes, we're going to have an open discussion about the recommendations and some of the things we're hoping you'll keep in mind as you're discussing the recommendations. If you scroll down, if you're already on the document, you'll scroll down to the second page and you'll see the start of a table. And the table has the recommendation in the left-hand side. It'll say category and then item, and under the item is the recommendation that everyone evaluated in one of our earlier surveys a little over a month ago. And we have the mean, the average rating, the SD, the standard deviation listed, the variance, so what was the lowest versus the highest, how far apart are those scores, and then the minimum and the maximum rating. So we've put these in order of mean from the highest to the lowest. They aren't necessarily meant to be ranked that way, so we'll go through them one by one. If you see an item that's highlighted in yellow, this was an item from last year's recommendation that carries over into this year's recommendations. So with that, I'd invite everyone, I see quite a few cursors blinking, to either look at this page on Google Doc or open up your Microsoft Word version that was sent to you in your agenda packet. And let's begin discussing. So let's first skip past narrative. We can come back to that and let's look at the recommendations. As we're doing this, so I want you to keep in mind, are there any case studies or examples or elements of narrative that we could be including in the final report out that we should be making a note of as we're doing this? So our first question for recommendations, even though we have listed these from the highest to the lowest mean, that doesn't necessarily mean they're ordered in any significant way. We didn't ask people to make rank one over the other, but now we'll open it up to conversation. Are any of these recommendations higher priorities than others? And now that I've spoken for 2 or 3 minutes solid, I will step back and we will begin our conversation. So any higher priorities above it, these can be combined. It's always the first person to jump into the pool. Or rather than higher priorities, are any of these more salient? Oh, yes.
I
Rachel.
was gonna offer that DPI has worked with some different communities to, in a similar way. There were some schools that were part of the Broadband Connectors pilot program, and DPI has worked with several. I'm not sure if it really would be enough for a case study. I don't know that it has resulted in grant applications or grant funding, but I wanted to put that out there that we could pull together some information I think would be helpful for this area.
That would be great. Yeah. And even if at this stage, not everything will have a concrete result, I think, just the understanding and the knowledge that things are happening out there and how they're happening might be very useful.
Okay.
Yeah. And Marta, you unmuted for a second.
I did. I am looking at the second one, continue emphasizing supporting the work of organizations and other stakeholders. And then the fourth one, partner struggling communities with experienced entities for technical assistance. Are those necessarily, could they be rolled in together? Because we're talking about supporting strong stakeholders and then, or assisting strong stakeholders and then supporting struggling communities. Do they necessarily need to be separate, or are they related? I'm just curious on how we're looking at whatever the support piece they both seem to be related to supporting them. So, I'm not saying this well. They seem related to providing support for existing strong communities and struggling communities.
I think I understand what you say. Task force members, what are your reactions?
I'm looking at the criteria, and recently I think most of us received that message from Extension saying that they were trying to find data and information about priorities and about what were the recommendations and all this stuff. So one of the things that was in that was what we have been talking about from the beginning, which is the mapping, right? So I think the second one, fund annual statewide mapping efforts that support stakeholder networks, physical infrastructure networking, and overall broadband planning efforts is extremely important. It's one of the first steps that needs to happen. So that should be a priority. The first one, create a statewide map of middle mile. That could be rolled into, because that would be part of a mapping, right? I think, part of that information that would be available in the mapping would be, the map of middle mile. So that's my sense.
Can I just interject really quickly? I wonder, Sal, are you looking at the document that says resources at the top rather than networking?
Yeah. Oh, we're networking. Yeah, I'm looking at resources. Sorry about that. Oh,
those are really strong.
Way ahead. Sorry about that. Okay,
If you
sorry.
could reserve a little
I'll
bit,
go
but
back
let's
and
go
read that.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that.
That we are second half, we're going to come back and we're going to start with that. Thanks, Sal. Yeah. So thought, and Gail, you unmuted.
Yeah, I'm going back to networking and looking at, I think the question that Rachel was posing, or was it Rachel or Marta? Do some of those, are they repeating themselves or could they be combined? And I do think as we take a look at providing that technical assistance, I mean, we are providing it to struggling communities a lot of times. And they may not know where. Struggling communities are definitely a part of that. So I think some of that, where I'm looking at the fourth one, fourth one and the fifth one, I think a lot of those kind of blend together. We might be able to blend some of those as long as we don't lose, any of the specific points within them. But I do think some of those emphasizing supporting organizations, I think that's all, helps, is part of that technical assistance. And we might get at more of the details as we get into resources to help make that happen.
Kind of looks to me like 1 and 6 could probably be combined as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think when you look at them, you can sort of see there's technical support, there's dialogue and connection. There are the network. I mean, it's all networking. We're bringing people together. It's sort of the reasons under which we're bringing people together, and what those kind of groups of or pockets of support look like.
Yeah. Now that I read the network part, Brittany, thank you for pointing that out. I think we have talked about number 2 about continue to emphasize supporting organizations that already have the trust on communities. That's very important. We had talked about extensively, and that goes well with the third one: establish and support a coalition of willing, engaged broadband leaders, because that's exactly the kind of leaders, those that the community already trusts, that we want to be engaged, that are willing to be engaged, and that can provide that technical support or other kind of support about the opportunities in their community. So I think those two probably go hand in hand together as well.
Gail?
Yep, and on that same vein, when you're talking about that trust, I want to go down to the comments part as we're dealing with tribal communities, because I think it's really important as we take a look at digital equity and inclusion, not just tribal communities, but I want to make sure we don't lose that emphasis of those other communities. I see Sal nodding, but I just think that's really important that we don't lose that and somehow capture that, because I think that's critical in the work that we're doing.
So we've talked about combining. Are there, going back to the question, are there any others that we should emphasize as a priority? And maybe not a higher priority, and we might not feel comfortable saying one is prioritized over the other, but are there any of these that we should emphasize as a priority more immediately than others?
During our meetings, we did hear from some guests that repeatedly talked about number 4, about partnering struggling communities with more experienced groups that have done this work. And that was something that we heard multiple times from the guests that came in.
On that same vein, just reflecting on when we spoke to the League of Municipalities and the Towns Association, the interaction between the municipal organizations, the ISPs, the federal agencies, all is going to be a growing issue as more of those federal dollars flow down, and making sure that there's an understanding of how to access them. So if there's a way to even articulate the concerns going forth, especially with the way that things are possibly going to be formulated because of the infrastructure related funds, I think that one has a lot of credence to be supported.
Gail?
And on that same vein, I would want to make sure we capture the fact as those funds start coming down, that we're looking at them for the community planning, the technical assistance, all those types of things that need networking to happen. And that wraps right into that regionalism, those communities, as well as how we pull in those trusted people within those communities to do that work.
It looks to me many times like a lot of these are very important. It's like there's not one more important than the other, because we're going to need all of them for success. So trying to prioritize one over the other might get in the way of accomplishing what we want. Obviously, there's so many different federal funds, like we talked about the last time, so many different grants that we need to understand what apply better to ones, when apply better to others. This, a partnership between all these, organizations and entities is very important. It's extremely important. But as well is the trust that the communities have to have, like we were talking about. How to engage those communities also with these other entities so that we can be successful. And that communication and information is important. So I think many times trying to say one is more prioritary than the other could get in the way. Instead of, there's some of these that probably could be merged together because they are kind of the same point, instead of having too many of those, and just say, this is what we want to accomplish. That's just my sense.
It's important to capture that too. If this is a situation of everything needing to move forward together and we need to accomplish all of these things, it's important to capture that too. So thank you, Sal. Yeah.
This is Jose. I trying to process the 1 and 4 and the 5 and 6 combination. I thought 3 for me, because I know that we've been talking about having this consortium of individuals that may have gone through the process. And I saw that number 3 has great value, especially that there are some perhaps other elements that may be tied into number 3. If you do have this coalition of individuals that can serve as a support system or serve also as a technical system, I think it could address some of the other elements that we had identified here that could become this entity that could provide that support for those municipalities that may be struggling to come together in unison, or in some instances, being able to act as an example for some of these stakeholders that are trying to connect together. So I saw some value in number 3. If I know, I agree with Sal that all of these have an important element in terms of importance. I just saw number 3 perhaps being one of those elements that maybe we can focus most of our attention, if not perhaps build our basis from that, because then we're taking these groups that have gone through the process and then use this group as our technical support arm that perhaps can help us navigate for the rest of these municipalities or local entities that may be having some difficulty in making this work. But that's my 2 cents.
This is Celeste. I agree with that. I also think 3 is highlighted because it's a carryover you had mentioned, which to me just means that at least the members of the task force feels it's very important. And so if we're just discussing, possibly prioritizing or combining, number 3 that would be something that I would prioritize, maybe just add the word agency. I don't know, based on Brittany's comments. I would also agree that 4 and 5 you could combine into one.
I think what we've done is taken that number 3 from last year and kind of expanded on it a little bit in the other comments. So it almost would make sense to, I don't know if you.
Lori, I think we've lost you. Oh, there you are. You're back.
Oh, my bad.
You're back.
And then highlighting that number 3 as our main.
We can hear me. We can hear
Okay,
you.
sorry.
Yes. Yeah.
As our main concept, and then some of the newer things really kind of fall under that. Another comment I was going to make was, and we haven't.
Oh, and Laura, you froze up again.
Grants.
There you are. You're back.
Okay, I think I have a router issue. Most of these grants require public-private partnerships, and we haven't really talked about that too much, but that does kind of come into this group really nicely as well, and I don't know how we may or may not want to address that.
I think that's an excellent point, Lori. How to the rest of the task force members, how might we want to address public-private partnerships? Is this the correct place for it? How might we capture certainly a lot of what we heard throughout the course of our speakers this year?
I wonder if that's an articulation and when we get to the narrative part, because I think that does really work nicely in the exposition of the issue, meaning that we understand that, in order to create public-private partnerships of importance that are going to be working on multi-million-dollar projects, there has to be trust. There has to be an ability to have a sense of, longevity and track record connected inside of it. And although it's a crucial issue in areas, there's going to be need for assistance in building those relationships. And as we're talking about this, I think, the other thing that I don't think these recommendations state in particular, but in order to do quick work of this, there has to be people who are appointed to do this as their job, quite frankly, right? So, although it seems nebulous when you're working and building out these networks, you still have to have a strong point person, either at the state level or regionally. You have to have strong point people at the local level. So, to make sure that there's strong nodes within the whole entire networked system.
Gail, you raised your hand.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going back to Lori's point about the public-private partnership. And as I'm looking at the 6 recommendations that are there, we mentioned the ISPs and the creating ways for communities, stakeholders, and ISPs, who have interest in that first one, and then fostering dialogue in that last one, number 6. And I'm wondering if we might even want to beef up that language there and to add that public-private partnership in the 2 of those, I guess. And I would create ways and more than just foster dialogue and interaction, but I really am encouraging communities to look at developing formal partnerships. I want folks to really look at what it means to be a partner, a public-private partner. And that's one of the things we're really encouraging as we're working, as communities are looking at doing plans and interviewing and working with ISPs is what does it mean to be a partner? And what are the rights and responsibilities? Because I want them to really look at rights and responsibilities as well. And so I think we could hit Lori's point in by just maybe tweaking the language in 1 and 3 to include that public-private partnership. But I would really be looking at how do we really truly make it a partnership with some type of partnership agreement. I think that's important.
I like that. Well said, Gil.
And Dr. Baker just arrived at the meeting. Dr. Baker, welcome. I will drop in the chat a link to the Google document that we're using. And Andy, you had your hand up. So Andy.
So on all the projects and grants that have been done, they all had to have a partnership with the private sector. I mean, without a partnership on that side, unless I'm missing something, I mean, you can't really move forward with any project. So, I mean, you're going to have a partnership whether you want it or not, unless you're, Reedsburg Utility or whoever's the last, municipal partner or municipal provider left. I don't know, just seems, I mean, you're going to have that partnership one way or another, whether you want to or not. Unless I'm missing something.
And Gail?
And Andy, I would say that, yes, we talk about public-private partnership, but a private partner can apply for those funds without a public partner. There's more points given to partnership, but sometimes we have projects that the public partner isn't really active and aren't really taking a having responsibility for. And so that's why I'm saying we really need to look at what is a public-private partnership and have an agreement looking at roles and responsibilities. Because I think right now we talk about that, but we're not really defining what that means. And private partners can get funding without a public partner.
Yeah, so you're saying that if a private ISP or company wants to go ahead and get some funds, like they shouldn't be eligible unless they have a public partner, or you think they should get more points to have that public partner in that engagement? Is that what you're saying?
Well, right now I'm saying that I think get more points. They're not required to, but I think it's important that those conversations and that there's some kind of agreement to what's happening. So it's a systematic, planned out approach.
Fair enough. Sounds good to me.
Jean, you've raised your hand.
Yeah, so on the public-private partnerships, I think in today's world, there's a wide spectrum of what a public-private partnership is. And it can mean different things to different communities and different things to the providers. And somehow bringing those two people or entities together and having an agreement on what is a public-private partnership and can everybody agree to all the terms, I think is key, because otherwise, you're going to continue to have a whole wide variety of applicants and different levels of partnerships. And so to the extent we can facilitate getting to a standard on what a public-private partnership is, I think that would help.
Marta.
Yeah, I also think one of the things that we're all sort of saying that is that we're writing a report here and we're making recommendations. And I think fostering dialogue and interaction is a little more amorphous, and we need some words that have a little more direction in them. And so if we're thinking about how we take the general idea of that statement and write it in a way that it provides a little more direction, fostering isn't enough. We've got to have, as Gail is, I think, saying, we need to have a way to do that through arrangement and partnership, more formalizing what that dialogue looks like. We're not just fostering it, you're getting together and you're creating a thing. Is that right, Gail? Am I representing correctly what I think you're saying?
That's what I'm saying.
So let's unpack that, because that would be an important point. When we say fostering dialogue, and when we say creating these relationships or these networks, what specific actions or outcomes are we looking for?
I know we're not to the resources, but some often communities who are really looking at addressing this problem are asking for guidance in how to put these dialogues together. What is, who should be at the table? What is a sequence of events? Formulating that, playbook. And we're going to get to that and the resources, I think, which is really good. I think it's, there's a reason why we separated them, because I think we need to say, these have to be systematic, long-term conversations that are a series of conversations, not one-offs. They're meetings that build upon each other. Work for leading to a grant sometimes starts 6 months to a year prior for the communities that are not in a factor of readiness. So I think, again, and I love the part of the wordsmithing, because you're trying to synthesize these big ideas down into one word. So I think, how do I leave that to the group to kind of work through what we want to say instead of fostering, because I think fostering is like, you're right, it's like just bringing these people together, but this is more of like, we need to see you follow through in order to get to this point, right?
Marta.
So maybe instead of fostering dialogue and interaction, we could provide roadmaps for dialogue and interaction. Develop roadmaps, provide something that shows there's actually a process, something that demonstrates a process for moving these conversations forward, because nothing can happen obviously without a coalition of willing and engaged leaders, and that we need to get those people together, and then we need to outline a process for them in some way so that they can move forward in a formalized way. They may have to sift and winnow the partners over time to find out who are the right people to be in the room, but to bring them together, we have to give them an outline for how to have those conversations, to maybe take that initial group of willing and distill it more into the actual group.
So we're starting to become less ambiguous than with that term. We've talked outline, we've said roadmap, we've said, we've gone from fostering dialogue to talking about who do we need, what are the types of people and groups that we're needing to bring to that table. We've talked about order of events, checklist, 6 months, 3 months, 2 months, 1 month, day after sense. So let's keep that. Gail, your hand is raised.
Got to hit all the buttons. I want to go back to Jean and to Marta when they were talking about the partnership, and maybe, how do we require that there's a true partnership? It's two ways. And because I think we're hearing from a provider, and we're hearing, from public saying we need it from both. Providers need communities to be responsible too and help them out. And it goes both ways. And so I want to make sure that both parties know their responsibilities and how they're going to help out. I mean, I'm not saying we should do it for one or the other. They both need to make it work in order to be successful. And I just think, we've kind of danced around public-private partnership and say it's a nice thing, but I really think we need to really require that there's true partnerships and they come up with some type of a partnership agreement.
Lori?
Yeah, so I'm starting to hear kind of two different things here. One is a recommendation to some entity, and I don't know who that entity is, to establish or create this roadmap. And then we're also hearing that we need to help communities and providers create the partnerships based on the roadmap. Does that start to make a clearer path?
I think that's insightful. I think that's kind of the two things that we're perhaps talking about here. We're kind of arriving at. So would we like to open up each one of those things and say what, when we're talking about at a minimum, if a community or an ISP wants to provide broadband to a geographic area, you need an ISP and you need a community, like the very basic building blocks. Now that's pretty ambiguous in some ways. If we needed to make a list of who needs to be at the table, who would we say needs to be at the table? ISP and who from the community, or what in your experience, because we just have such a brain trust here, who needs to be at that table?
I'll just interject that UW Extension and again with WEDC as well and with the PSE broadband pilot, they have the beginnings and workings and have been working with some of that. So if you asked if you asked Gail, who does this in communities, she can tell you who's part of that. I wonder if it would be getting into the weeds in right now and asking who is at the table on that side, just because it will probably, I don't know. I think the recommendations really allude to who needs to be there. There needs to be local leadership. There has to be clear conversations with the ISPs. There needs to be clear conversations with the federal and state funding streams to make sure that there's understanding. There's a ton of training that needs to go on as well. So, there's a lot of organizational partners. So I almost wonder if it's, we're talking about the ISPs and the community side, but there's also the network itself, and then an individual community who is working on their problem, and the organizational structure is different. But what is potentially lacking at this point is the systematized way that this network is established, which I think these recommendations are working towards, right? And so yes, definitely to kind of that blueprint and all of that stuff. I think there's in the resources we get to, funding technical assistance, which would be part of that training. In my mind, I'm thinking through that public-private partnership item. What happens if there is a way that in applying for a grant, you have to provide evidence of that inside of the grant process, right? There could be a template for the community and the ISP to work off of, and there's things that they could omit and add, as with any contract, but perhaps that will clarify for very many people, especially in the process, that because it is due when you're turning in your grant application. It could be done before, but it certainly needs to be in place for that grant.
Gail.
Getting to Brittany's point, and talking about some of the things that Extension had talked about. And I know I had done a presentation on what the National Extension Group had done with community planning and the curriculum that we have. And that might be one of those case examples that we use, how those communities in the other state that we've done pilots with are utilizing that to develop these. And a piece of that is that contract? How do you develop in the template for the contract and community plan along with those steps? So I'm not sure if that would maybe be a case example that could go either in here or in the resources. But I just offer that up. I mean, I know it's something we shared with the whole group, a general part, but I think we've got that curriculum that we could easily put a case study with that.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks for the course correction, Brittany, before I took us down that rabbit hole. So
I'm
as we're
doing that, I'm usually in the rabbit holes.
yeah. So as we're looking at the remaining recommendations, it feels like we have some consensus around the need for a structure behind these ambiguous recommendations of creating networks and establishing relationships. As we're looking at the recommendations, is there anything in the recommendations that we need to tease out a little bit more? Is there anything that is missing? We have had some great discussions, but oftentimes subsequent discussions highlight elements that we might not have thought of a couple of months ago. And Gail.
I just encourage us to look down at the comments as well, because they're not part of the recommendations. And I think, you know, we've talked a little bit about how we include tribal or other marginally represented groups up above as we're doing those conversations, especially in that trusted Sal talk, trusted community, trust within community. Sal talked about that, but we really haven't talked about how we take a look at focus on equity and how we're dispersing and prioritizing some of those funds. I know, and I might have been in resources that kind of overlapped where somebody asked about mapping where funds were going and looking at them equitably, but I didn't make that comment down below, but somebody did and thought that was very important. And I guess I don't want to lose that. Just not sure where in those recommendations up above, or if that gets put in with resources.
I would second the need for language specifically about how to work with the tribal communities, especially in network. There needs to be specific ways to work with the two systems together to make sure that there's maximum capacity that's built into both sides. You know, being in the north part of the country, or the state. We are in the north part of the country. There are a number of tribes working on broadband, and you know, like how do we make sure that there's that concerted conversation, and that part that should be thought of as that systematic network building. And I think it would be appropriate to have some here.
And Sal, you unmuted?
No, I'm not muted.
Oh, okay.
I wasn't saying anything.
All right. I thought perhaps you had something to add.
No, Gail has the hand up again.
Oh, does he? I missed him. Go ahead, Gail.
I would just kind of echo Brittany's with the tribal aspect. One of the things I've seen, especially now with the federal funding coming down, tribes are not always part of those conversations, and people at the last minute are trying to figure out how to access those tribal funds to do build out. And sometimes those calls come at the week before those applications are due, but folks are looking at how they access the federal dollars. And I can tell you that that's really putting off some of our tribal partners because they're not seeing it as partnerships. So I think it goes right back to that conversation on how do we develop trust and what's the requirement for a partnership.
Well, I think different communities might need some essential partnerships, but others might be depending on their community. So as we have said about the rabbit hole, we don't want to predetermine what that has to be. I think each community will look at their community and say, these are the kind of partnerships that we want. And that's where the word fostering is when we're talking about fostering. How do we foster the right kind of partnerships for a community so that they can have success? I think that's where we have to kind of, work with instead of limiting with saying it has to be this, it has to be that. As you mentioned, Gail, before, there's some that, and Brittany, some that we do need. We need the providers, obviously. We need, some of those. But I think others, it's up to the community, especially tribal communities, who they want to partner with. They might want to partner essentially with one of the tribal colleges, which are essential in the communities, for example, and we don't have them named here. So those are just some things that we have to think about.
Other comments? Tom.
After having lived through the public-private partnership here for the last several years, and it's worked really well. One thing I've seen on our end, again, being up in northern Wisconsin, where we got a lack of expertise in these areas, is expectations that are laid out from these public partners, from both the private side and the public side. I think there's some expectations that were expected to come from the private side that we didn't see, and same thing that we did not provide that on the private side. And that kind of falls in the roadmap side of things, as far as when you put that together, what each side is looking for, so they know that they've got a valid relationship that's going to work going forward. And those expectations sometimes are either assumed or not known. And that I kind of I think they'll tie into the roadmap.
Maybe a careful articulation of expectations on both sides.
Right.
Yeah, we should note and preserve that. Other comments or experiences from task force members with regards to network and network building? What are some of the things that as we are moving towards the report, are there specific case studies in addition to those that we identified in policy for those of you who were present in that conversation, or those of you that have read the post-meeting notes? Are there any particularly good examples that we might want to highlight as being effective? Or anything we can add that would enhance our recommendations?
I would just thumbs up to the trusted messenger element that Gail was bringing up. That's an important, but I have nothing additional to add that hasn't been added already.
I think in the policy conversation and policy recommendations, the same question was asked. There were, I think, the example of the city of Cross, or town of Cross, I'm sorry, I think it's a town, came up, right? So, that is a really strong example of how they went through it. They also were part of the pilot, the broadband pilot. So I think it's a strong story of how that works. I think Gail mentioned I forget the acronym, I apologize, but an example of that work that can be brought into Wisconsin and will be brought into Wisconsin, and particularly on the part about clarifying public-private partnerships, might be a really strong way of lifting up, oh, this happened in this state. I'm sure we can figure out how to make it work here.
Other task force members, we have some task force members who haven't unmuted in the last 15, 20 minutes. Is there anything that we should be thinking about, or that we need to add, or thoughts or reactions to anything that has been said? None. So one of the things that we had planned on doing is for our last 30 minutes or so of each of these conversations is just opening up the floor to discuss networks first and then resources later on today more broadly. Brittany, do we think we're at that point where we should just open it up for general conversation, or are there some other things that we should discuss within the
No, I think,
recommendations?
and I think we could kind of tuck it in. I'm just looking at the item that says, you know, if how are these recommendations measured for success, right? So maybe it would be helpful to be able to, when we're in this 30-minute period, think about what it would look like. Another prompt from above was, what does this look like when it's completed, right? So just to kind of frame the thinking on that kind of, so it's almost like blue skying it, but also looking at what we need to measure. But it can be very conversational, I think.
So what are your thoughts, task force? What are our measurable outcomes? What does this look like? What are your reactions to networks?
Well, I don't know what obviously the measurable outcomes are what we're trying to accomplish, which is, complete coverage and accessibility and adoption as much as possible by, the Wisconsin communities, right? That everyone has access to what they need to be able to be successful in today's age. How do we determine what that is? That's the question. But one way in which we can track that we had talked about, obviously, we can have dashboards that track where are we investing, what have been the outcomes of the funds that we are investing, where do we need, which areas of the state, the mapping that we talked about, which areas of the state are still to be reached. That will determine a lot where our next steps are for funding, for example, or for efforts to expand opportunity. So those are the things that we need to have available, not just for those who are making decisions, but for the public in general. I think it's extremely important. That's how I would track it. But the question is, what does success look like, right? And that's the question that somebody with more expertise in this area would probably be able to answer.
What are our thoughts? We can think in terms of the end result is, coverage across the state and widespread broadband adoption and underserved communities, receiving the assistance that they need and the resources that they need. In between point A, which we're at now, and that end point, what are some of the things that we might be looking at along the way that would indicate we're on the right track?
This is Katie from Senator Markline's office. I'm sorry to step backwards, but Sal just made me think of something. One thing I think is when we hear from communities that are looking for information as far as what's been successful in the past, is it's kind of hard to access some of the old information, past applications, that kind of thing, because it's all in the ERF, which I know is part of the function of PSC. But those of you at PSC, it's, if you don't work at PSC, it's kind of like, oh my gosh, this is just a monster that I don't know how to navigate. So I'm almost wondering if, to Sal's point, just making things accessible in a way that just anybody can do it. And maybe it's making information in a dashboard setup that crosses administrations, that is more user-friendly, that kind of thing. So for what it's worth.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Katie. Other suggestions and ideas? Gail.
I think to build on Katie's point, I think you're right. It's sometimes difficult. The information is there, but how you sift through it. And as we look at how do we measure, focusing on equity, some of that on the comments below and where those dollars are going. Some of those maps and some of the things that evaluate what some of that is and collecting some of that data. If we were to map that in a way that was more visual, we'd be able to tell if we're really meeting that goal of equity and where those dollars are spread out and where they're going to and where the communities are. I think that might be helpful as a step to take a look at. The other one might be the number of partnerships that we take a look at along the way that actually have some type of agreements or partnership agreement or contracts as they submit and apply for those grants. Those that, to Sal's point, they're not all going to be the same, right? Communities are unique, but we want to look at the number of people we're including in those partnerships now, especially people who haven't been part of those conversations before. I think that's something we can track to show that our success and who we're reaching out to, as well as how well we're doing tracking, reaching from community to community, right? It's sometimes we start with the town of Cross, which is small, but how does that fit with the community next to it within their economic region, as we take a look at broader, because as we start to look at accessing more of those federal dollars, we're going to be looking at bigger projects, right? And so we need all those pieces to connect together, especially later on when we talk about middle mile. So that would be another thing that we should be tracking, those number of partnerships and how well we're doing connecting the partnerships to each other.
I was definitely say number of new partnerships, number of new census tracts or zip codes reached. Those type of metrics are really good.
And just speaking from working in the nonprofit sector for so many years, this type of work is really communication, and it's sometimes underfunded, but this, network building takes someone this is their only task, maybe even a team of people, since it's a statewide initiative that is really dedicated to being clean and thorough and putting all of these conversations together for the partners on the ground, for the partners at a regional level. I hope that this is what is a clear investment of those infrastructure dollars, because that will make this type of work successful. It is the investment towards building out this type of work that could be extremely beneficial. Other states have done that, and I can't think of off the top of my head. I think of other initiatives that have done the same thing, but it's a certainly, it feels ambiguous, and people are like, oh, they're just going to, cluster together and they're going to take care of themselves. No, there needs to be someone who is at the top being thoughtful and being very methodic in how this develops.
I always say it's good community development work. We're doing broadband's our topic we're really focusing on right now. But in order to achieve our goals, we need good community development fundamentals to help us reach the goals.
Other comments or measurable items that we could be looking for as we're watching this evolve over the next few years?
Kristen, one of the things that Wisconsin schools have been collecting for 2 years is information about student access to connect and then to be able to stream video for learning. And each school district has the opportunity to collect that information and then report that back. And the Department of Public Instruction has dashboards to display that information by school district and then in aggregate for the state. And so we're seeing that like a local task force, a county board, a regional development commission will contact us to ask about the data for the school districts in their county or their region. And that's sort of a starting point for them with collecting other data that they need in order to engage in this planning. And it's sort of a starting point. And so we have that data available as well, and we could put that in the resources when we get to that point.
That's wonderful. So questions, you've got data on the number of students with access and how that changes over time. Do you have any indication of how many inquiries are being made?
Yes, I could look at that and figure out how many inquiries are made. Sometimes it's folks that are working on a grant and then they're wondering, it's making that connection, helping find that matchmaking, right, between the school district and the person working on that for their region or their task force. So
wonderful. Thank you. That's a great resource. Other comments, other measurable items, other things we should note about networks. Gail, your comment of community development, really, important to keep in mind. Brittany.
I'm sorry, Celeste, you can go first.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, the information is always changing. So that also calls to the fact that even those who are in leadership positions are always going to be learning as well. So even the leaders need training, ongoing training, right? So that's again part of like if you're building something new, you've got to have that person who's driving those conversations as well. And I think another way of measuring it is, how many times X consortium, I'm going to use the regional level because that's where I live. How many meetings have you had? Have you seen the information used on the local level? And if a community a county didn't have a broadband task force, did you help them stand one up? Like there's certainly some checklists that can be done that are slightly different at each of those different viewpoints. But I would stress that, we're convening the regional planning commissions and the regional economic development individuals monthly because everyone is learning on this and they get to take that back to their communities and everyone is learning. So I think there needs to be something tucked in here that we know this is a continually changing landscape and we need to be really following back up with each other, making sure that information is used. And that's a good community development tactic.
Celeste.
This may have already been brought up, but I also think that, the staff could also provide valuable information or maybe ways we can measure based on all the successful partnerships that have, everything we've already built in the past, like what works in certain counties, what have they seen, what are the successful partnerships, what accelerates, build out, where have we fallen short, where, things have been delayed. But all of those things we can measure against what we know, based on all the public-private partnerships that have already been approved over the years.
Mining of the data, quantifying, capturing what we already know. Yeah. Gail.
I think to Celeste's point, and it might be in resources, I'm not looking at that page right now, but somebody had made a comment in the comments sections about evaluating just those things that Celeste had talked about, is let's evaluate those projects. to where our money has gone before in those partnerships and those resources. And I think that's an important thing once we evaluate them, but then also put them out there as, I don't remember who was talking, if it was Katie or Marta, that, you know, where everyone can see them and easily find those as they're looking for examples.
Jean.
As we're talking, this is kind of resource related, but I'm also thinking about, you know, as we move forward, mapping is important. And we've been focused, it feels like, on what the state's done for mapping, which is great. It's a good tool. But I think the piece that's missing is we have all this other federal funding that has already been put out into the environment. And there's a whole bunch more coming in the future. So somehow we need to be able to encompass all that data and make sure we have accurate picture of what's been built by who using what monies, because otherwise we're going to be tracking just piece parts, and there might be other opportunities for providers or municipalities to work together with some other pool of money. So it's just I think we got to bring that into figuring out how we're measuring our success. You know, our goal is, you know, by 2025, everybody's got 25.3. Well, how, you know, how accurate are all the maps, and can we pull in what the FCC is doing? And it's a continual evolution of improvement and nothing static.
I think that evaluation was that Jean just talked about was in resources, and it did, someone did mention, you know, the federal dollars that had come down before, that we heard a little bit from some of the folks who were involved in those projects 10 years ago, but how the private partner and the public partners were working together since then, and how, like Jean said, how are those mapped and what are the successes and how do we build on those, or how do we correct mistakes that maybe we made along the way to make better use of those.
Excellent points. This is all great. What other ideas do we have? Information that we should be capturing and including? Rachel.
Yes, I just had a clarifying question. Jean, you were talking about maps and others have mentioned maps, and I'm wondering how those maps are different than what's already available through the Public Service Commission to see which layers and which grants are from which parts of the, like in the last round, you could go to it and you could see where grant applications were submitted from.
Yeah, so I mean, there's that level of map, there's census level mapping that's done, and providers have to submit that information to the Public Service Commission. The FCC is working on a new round of maps. So, you know, I think there's not necessarily, hasn't been in the past, consistency with what providers are providing mapping data and what information at what levels do they show the data. So we have a partial picture, I would say, but there's probably incomplete areas where there may be more service than the maps reflecting, or vice versa.
I see. Thank you.
Well, this is very technical based on what Rachel was mentioning. At what level of granularity you need to have those maps, right? What is the level of detail that you might need to be able to track progress? Because there's already a lot of mapping information, but we know that is not sufficient. From the beginning of this broadband task force, we knew that the data available about, you know, where broadband is available, where it is not available, is not complete. So, you know, I think that's why we're talking about the importance of having a certain level of certainty of where we're going to be able to make progress. That's just my sense.
Thank you. Thank you, Sal. Thank you, Sal. Andy.
No, Sal's talking about mapping. I'm a mapping guy. I got to jump in. Yeah, I mean, we all know that we got to pick a granular level that still protects privacies and other things that providers don't want to show, but we know that the census block level is not a suitable level to know what's going on out there, a real picture, because you can't say if one part of that census block, which are very large geographic areas in our northern part of the state, are covered, everybody's covered within that block. Is just ridiculous to try to know what's going on out there. So I think there's some ways we can do that and probably come to some agreement to map and show progress and help us analyze and know what the real picture of things are that, is really happening on the ground out there. And I think we're even seeing some of that stuff with speed data we're collecting. There's lots of other statewide layers available that can help supplement and help us make good decisions on where things are at, or even analyzing student stuff from DPI, again, at a level that still protects some privacy, but shows us a better picture than the census blocks. It's just not a good geography to do it.
Other comments or suggestions? Right. Seeing none, is there anything else about networks that we should bring to the surface? If not, then might this be a good time, and Brittany, I'll let you weigh in on this, to take our 10-minute break, stretch legs.
Yeah.
Mm.
So, Jaren, I think you pause this usually. I'm not necessarily sure. But yes, so let's all plan to be back at 2:27. So stretch your legs, get some water, coffee, whatever you need, and we will be back very shortly. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I hope your break was productive. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to turn it back over to Kristen and we will proceed.
Thank you, Brittany. And second verse, similar to the first, I have dropped in the chat a tiny URL that will take you to the Google Doc for the resource page that we'll be working off of. And again, if you don't have access to this, this is almost identical to the Word document that you received in your agenda packet. The Google Doc is turned landscape form. I believe the Word document is portrait. Those are the only differences in it. As to orient ourselves again, top of the page, very first page, you'll see it should say resources. Narrative, we'll come back and discuss after we look at the recommendations. So similar in format to last hour's conversation. When you are looking at the recommendations, they're somewhat ordered here. We've broken them into subcategories. They're a little bit more ordered than the last because there are significantly more recommendations under resources. So there's an item number on the left-hand side that we can use for our second column from the left that we can use for reference as we're discussing. But you can see that we have grouped things into resource mapping and data, resource technical assistance tools, resource state agency relationship building. And then at the bottom, there are comments, and there are more comments regarding this grouping of recommendations than there were in the previous recommendations. So if you scrolled all the way down to the bottom of the doc, you'll see that there are comments on, again, focusing on equity, understanding the needs throughout the state and prioritizing efforts and funding equitably. There isn't enough tribal specific language in the planning and approaches. A few items the task force discussed that one of our task force members did not see included in the recommendation included efforts should be made to identify and attract private foundations. The PSC broadband site should clearly define broadband grant, and improved communications between all state departments and agencies impacting broadband access and develop or adoption should be a priority. And I've just read the first lines of those. So if you don't mind going down and scrolling those, give ourselves a second to get oriented. And there's additional recommendations beyond that or comments beyond that. Then I'll give us a minute here to get a little bit oriented and read through the document. Then we will go back up and we will begin discussing recommendations. So let's just take a minute or two to read for a second to refresh ourselves. And while we're finishing up reading, also a reminder that the items in yellow were items that carried over from last year's set of recommendations. So again, that's what the yellow highlights mean. So with that, and feel free to continue reading as we're doing this. It's okay if we have a few seconds of silence as we're getting oriented here. When you're reading over the recommendations, our first question, our first prompt is, are any higher priority than others, or any particularly salient or important when you're looking at this list? And this is a significantly longer list than last time. So it's all right to have several priorities. It's all right to say they're equally prioritized. But when you're looking at this list, do you perceive any as being higher priority than others, or any that are particularly salient and important at the moment?
Hi, Kristen, this is Jose. Just my initial reaction. I think there's something to be said about value when we identify priorities in the last recommendation and looking at the priorities in this set of recommendations. Perhaps there should be some discussion in terms of a continuum, because I think sometimes we see impact over a period of time. And I'm not sure whether, when I look at some of these recommendations, I'm not sure whether we're at a fullest where we have met the objective of those set of recommendation. In some instances, I see quite a few other items that have been added. It could be subset of those original recommendations. And so therefore, I call it being more refined in terms of preset of recommendations. And perhaps there could, in many instances, and maybe the task force could say, hey, we continue to hold fast in the original preset of recommendations that continue to fall over with the additional caveats so that we don't lose sight in terms of measurement. Because I think earlier we spent a lot of time discussing value sets in terms of how can we measure progress over a period of time. And the only way that we can do that if we maintain some sort of element across periods of time. Since we looked at last year, now we're looking at this year. In order for us to be able to see and determine whether there has been impact in the funding and the available funding or resources, then perhaps there should be something said about keeping some of these value sets. With that said, I know that perhaps in the last discussion that we were having, we talked about mapping, and then of course on item number 2 here, or number 2, here we are funding a statewide mapping efforts, because I do remember in one of our conversations, we talked about perhaps the inconsistency or the lack of updated mapping that could be used. But perhaps maybe that could be one of the additional elements or recommendations that we want to make sure that we do have a well-defined mechanism in place that needs to be funded so that we can track over time. So then if we're looking at data sets and we're looking at, how effective these resources have been, then perhaps that number 2 plays a critical role, because then we could use that in terms of being able to map progress over periods of time. And these could essentially be the overlays that we're looking for, looking at base point where we were before, and then being able to, over periods of time, being able to track how these resources have been utilized and how effective they're being utilized. And so therefore, when we're looking at sub data points, I know that earlier Dr. Baker mentioned, well, looking at zip codes, and we can narrow it down to zip codes and even perhaps a further in looking at municipalities, because sometimes municipalities get lost in the zip codes, and looking at municipalities, because that's where, you know, we want to see the bigger bang, because in some municipalities, not to say that Milwaukee County, there are no gaps, there certainly are gaps by and large, but perhaps being able to see where there has been substantially progress made in these areas that have been identified before as deserts, that there had been no infrastructure, and now these added resources or the infusion of resources that allow us to make this gain and being able to provide at least some sort of connectivity available for the community. Thank you.
Those are great points. Thank you, Jose.
Yeah, I think I started the conversation when we started the meeting precisely with this point, right? The mapping issue. But that what Jose was talking about is extremely important. How do we track that effort, right? Which we already talked about. They go hand in hand, right? We have the mapping, then we have to track where the progress is being made, and where the areas of you know, desert areas, or where we haven't been able to reach for decision-making purposes. So those are very important things. You know, at a different point, one of the talks that we had in continuous is who should we be partnering with? And one that I know is one of the groups that could be part of this effort that is not mentioned here is community organizations. And they are the ones that many times do have the best trust in the communities. It's not necessarily the universities or, you know, or even DPI. The communities are connected to those community organizations, such as Jose's, UMOS, for example. So those maybe should be named so that they are not left behind as examples. If we don't give the example, sometimes we forget about them. So those are just a couple of points I want to make.
Thank you, Sal. Thank you very much. Brittany, you and Mike.
So just building off of what Sal said, in the additional notes, certainly that was also felt like by someone else, and I think that's on, there's no page numbers, but page 4-ish, but funding should be made available to existing organizations, schools, libraries, extension, economic development, probably add nonprofits, community service organizations that have already trusted relationships. That sounds like a grant application program, right? Connected to all of this. And I think, you know, that dovetails with one of the only grant-ish ideas that's in here, which is create planning and implementation grants for regions and communities, which I think this starts to sound like these are recommendations for the infrastructure dollars that are flowing down as well, right? So here are the touch points that we really feel like they're the resources, the really necessary tools that we really feel will be very beneficial. I see one item that can be collapsed pretty easily. Number 2, which is funding statewide mapping efforts and planning that are also planning. And then where is it? Number 10, which is in essence one of those tools for planning. So collapsing that down so it doesn't have to be said twice is, I think, a really easy way of just eliminating that. It's interesting that's in mapping, but it's also mapping and planning. So it has two parts to it. So the utility is all the way to making sure that those communities are ready for the impending items. I think what gets lost sometimes in data collection and mapping is sometimes that mapping or data collection is the first step. It's really the interpretation of what the data says that is really important, and specifically for communities that don't have the expertise all the time. If you don't have a tool at the ready that they can be trained on, it's nothing to hand them a map, right? And so I think that should be a strong point as we're thinking about resources.
Brittany, I think if those two are combined, that the speed testing portion of number 10 should not get lost in number 2, because number 2 is about the statewide networks, physical infrastructure networking, and speed testing is part of number 10.
That's great. I think that's a good point.
Gail.
I do think elevating some of those comments that Brittany said and tying it just like who made the comment before about how do we measure? I think it was Marta. How do we move it from just a discussion to actually making it something that's meaty and a recommendation? Is moving some of those comments down below up to recommendations where it ties it to the funding will help pull some of those up. And those could be, like Sal was talking about, the community organizations, and Brittany talked about putting in those organizations with the trusted groups to do community planning and some of those. So I would hope that we could move some of those into a more proactive recommendation as to fund or a grant program or whatever, whether it's the mapping aspect of it that we're looking at for that continual mapping with the out products that we're looking at right now, or whether it's hiring someone to do community planning and do some of those. But I really think that elevates it to a recommendation.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you. Other comments? Are there other items that could be collapsed? We do have a lot of recommendations here. In some ways, they're each distinct. In other ways, there are, as we've just discussed, some overlaps. Marta.
So I am just kind of looking at the resources and technical tools, and absolutely, if we're creating a tool, then it belongs in a place. But I'm just thinking back to the exercise, the previous exercise where we were looking at networking and sort of defining those terms as things that might kind of become tools. So in between these categories of things, what's the best way? And I'm not, making a proposal here, but what's the best way to link do the resources need to live separately, or do they need to be linked to those action items in those other sections? How did we do it last time?
It's a great question. How was it done last time?
I think we had separate sections. If I'm thinking of it correctly, right? So although some of it was interwoven, we did have sections for mapping and data and funding and policy, like they were very separate. So I don't know if there was an internal rule where they had to have cross correlation. So I see what you're saying, because as I was reading this, I was like, oh, these are resources for a local level. These are resources at like a network understanding that don't exist. And again, I don't know if we need to tie them to the first portion. Specifically, I guess we when we're getting into the nitty-gritty of the report, maybe that sensibility needs to be thought through. But I see what you're saying. I can see, but I don't know if we need, I don't know if we need to really strongly tie them to each other.
Okay.
Does that make, but
And I'm not trying to open a can of worms, but I'm just thinking, I don't want to make the report longer than it needs to be. But just sort of, how do we correlate these things? Because some of them are really clearly supporting one another. Okay, thank you. That's all.
I could just quickly jump in from a staff perspective and say the last report, Brittany, you're right. We had policy, funding, mapping and data, and then the community alignment focused subcommittee, and then we also had a digital equity and inclusion one. But the way that those were fairly somewhat siloed in the report and how we kind of came to those with the subcommittees, but we did kind of tie them back together somewhat with that theme of access, affordability, and adoption throughout the entire report last time. So I'm not sure we necessarily need to do that this time, but just that's how we did it last time, crossing some of those subcommittee silos via the access, affordability, and adoption high level items. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Thank you, Jaren. Thank you. So any other items that could be collapsed or that should be broken apart into two? Alternatively, anything in this list that should be a higher priority than others? Marta?
14 and 15. One of them has to do with adopt. Are they the same?
I was just looking at that as well. I think that can be collapsed down.
Yeah.
Is number 16 referring to the surveys that might be done by different groups? Or does that tie into number 10 and number 2?
Task force, what are your thoughts on that?
What were the numbers again? Sorry, I'm counting.
Yeah, that's all right. Let's see here. It was number 10. Wait, I've lost my place.
Yeah, I was saying that number 16 to me looks more like surveys that would be done by a community to understand better the hesitation or assist with non-adoption and connecting potential users with programs and service. And number 10 and number 2 are more about dashboards and maps. But I wondered if they were similar enough to be combined.
And number 16 reads, in case you're looking at the Word document, assess broadband adoption and lack of adoption among households not adopting the internet based on means, needs, connectivity, and prioritization. And then 10 is continuing offering tools such as geo software to all counties as a tool for public facing speed tests. And 2 is fund annual statewide mapping networks.
Then number 7 is about the dashboards, developing dashboards.
Thank you.
Right,
So
right. I think you're feeling that strong. There just needs to be some clear cut dashboard central item thing portal where communities can go into that and access that information and or do, speed tests or surveys that are systematized so we're all getting the same information so it's usable across the board. I think is a really strong point. And I think to just bring up 16 was an item from the first round. And I would assume those others are like closer articulations this round. So maybe they are collapsed and just like there needs to be a dashboard, there needs to be a resource center for the community. But there also, I think that's really stated inside of 16 is there needs to be an assessment either at the local, but also at the aggregate level of what that's telling us and what new initiatives should look like. Again, because this is all moving, right? But I can see how the dashboard and tools things need to kind of coalesce.
Mhm.
And maybe number 16 is more examples of assessments that communities have done to better understand those that haven't adopted service yet. And maybe that's why it's pulled out separately. So I can see it both ways.
When you're talking dashboard, if you go down to the comments, the one that's the PSC site should clearly define broadband grant recipients. And it talks about mapping there. I would think that would be something on the dashboard that could be included. There's the one that talks about communication right under that one about state agencies. And the first part is the communications piece that I think was an issue that was identified actually last year with our task force, but the end part, office website, easy for public access, that gets down to the dashboard. The output of that activity. So those kind of need to be pushed up into that dashboard area somewhere.
Mhm. One question that I have, I'm going to have to leave in about 5 minutes. Unfortunately, I have a doctor's appointment. But one of the things is that a lot of these things that we have been talking about, if we compartmentalize them into separate kind of pots, we're missing the connectivity. How can we connect those? For example, if we need the mapping, okay, we are going to need funding to be able to do the mapping. Eventually, we want these local, organizations and entities and networks. In the secondary resources, we have a part where we need to fund the ability for those to give the information that they need. In addition, we have talked about navigators. So we need the funding for the navigators to be able to present to the communities the options, the opportunities, how to go about it, help them adopt them. So all these things are interconnected, and by keeping them in different pots is kind of, how do we prioritize, right? They might be funded one thing when in the other side we prioritize something that one is not being funded because that funding was not prioritized. I don't know if I'm on this, expressing what I mean. It's important to say this is important networking criteria, this is important resources, this is important policy. How can we connect all of those? There had to be a section where in the end, kind of like a conclusion, something like that, a summary. How do we connect all those things, and why did we make those decisions about the different parts of our recommendations, right? So that, like you said, the leaders that are really not, totally knowledgeable, we would say, or in that knowledge about what we're doing and what we're proposing, understand where we're coming from. Because I think a lot of these things kind of connect with each other and cannot be separate, because if we're missing one, we're not going to be able to accomplish the next one. Anyway, that's just a sense that I'm getting from all these conversations.
Right. And Sal, so I think that's really also what Marta was saying too, right? So, and
Right,
when
exactly.
you, right. So when you were thinking about that, so, we have an ongoing conversation about this, behind our monthly meetings. And one of those threads of the conversation was perhaps, we had the 3 A's that kind of ran through the first report, and we were talking about, and hadn't really finalized what it really meant. But there were 2 emerging things. It was the system and some of the pieces that weren't put in place, and the toolkit. And so when you're talking, there are pieces of the system that aren't put in place, and there are things that need to be in the toolkit so that the system works. And perhaps that is something that's inside of, some piece of the report, but we certainly were feeling that as well. What's the connecting tissue inside of all of this work? I certainly appreciate that interdependence, and you can't unfortunately focus on one area and not understand how it's going to be affecting another piece of the pie, right? So that certainly is a really great way of thinking about it. So the turn of the cube may become the system build out and what needs to be in the toolkit.
The toolkit. That's a great way to put it. Thank you very much. And sorry about this, but I have to leave now. Great conversations. Thank you. Every great recommendations, and take care. Have a great second part of or last hour, I suppose. Okay, take care. Thank you.
Thank you, Sal.
Thank you, Christine. Appreciate it. Bye.
Brittany, are you, where would you put the dashboard? Because I'm sensing that this dashboard is really kind of the central product, if you will, that we are recommending. And the toolkit is the dashboard within the toolkit, probably.
And then I think there's recommendations for funding technical assistance so people can access that toolkit, right? And so I think there's certainly the dashboard is the toolbox, right? And what could and should be in the toolbox, in the toolkit, right? And I don't want to overpower how the recommendations are shaped in giving that, but just know that was in the back of our head. And I'm trying to reflect at this point in last year, were we already talking about the 3 A's? Probably just about, right? So that was also emerging at that point too. But right, it's for me, I'm really looking at the recommendations at that. What is missing in the system? What is missing in the toolbox? And those champions who are funded to do the work inside of this new system that's built up.
The phrase that's coming to mind for me is building a system of support or designing a system of support. Is that perhaps a friendly summary of how we can bridge the two topics today and policy, our third big bucket. That would be consistent with community development and economic development systems thinking for sure. What other reactions do we have to these items that are on our list? Are there any other, not just things that we could collapse, but things that are maybe ambiguous, phrasing that could be refined, items that we might want to flag as particularly important? It feels that there's a little bit more consensus around this than there is around some of our earlier topics. I don't know if I'm just perceiving that or if that's the sentiment of the group. But is there anything on here just in the interest of uncovering non-consensus? Because that's really important. That usually means that if we have not a total consensus on an item, it means that item might need to be unpacked a little bit more. Is there anything on the list that people are looking at and thinking, I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, or I'd like to unpack that concept a little bit more? It's an invitation to play the devil's advocate a little bit.
I guess I would just encourage us to look at the comments below to make sure that any of them that I've heard quite a few of them talked about as being needed to be moved up. But are there any on there that shouldn't be moved up? Or I guess I just don't want to lose anybody's thought who somebody said that was really important just because it wasn't originally written as a recommendation, because these were comments that the task force members submitted. So I don't want to lose any of them, that they don't become part of a recommendation if there's something that we're missing. Or maybe it's easier, since we talked about so many, to say which ones shouldn't be part of a recommendation.
And Gail, along with that, before I go to you, Andy, there was a comment from the public that occurred at our policy meeting. So it did not make the handout, which was sent out in advance of that meeting. But there was a comment about considering in terms of equity, not just different communities, but also the needs of disabled citizens and citizens for whom access is not necessarily just a connection to the internet, but provides them with access to larger work world and communication tools that they might not otherwise have. So I will type that in as a bullet point so that we have it as a record. But one of the things that we did have was a comment about access and equity with regards to disability. Andy, up to you next.
I'm just thinking in general terms, you think we should try our best, which probably is almost impossible, to put some sort of dollar amount to some of these tasks and what we feel they would take. I'm all for mapping and data and making better decisions and, making sure we spend the money we have with the best, in the best ways that we can. But that may help us prioritize some of these items, because some of these might not be attainable just in a time frame or a cost frame that we want to have. I can't really give a perfect example, but I mean, that might help us eliminate some of these or move some things around to help us say, hey, to get this moving and doing what we're going to do, these three things we could afford to do. I'm worried that some of this stuff we'll hire a bunch of people or data and we'll, or helpers to do things, and all of a sudden we will have no money to do any infrastructure or anything. I'm not sure that'll happen, but I'm just thinking out loud.
Thoughts?
I'm thinking some of that is going to be dictated, and Alyssa would probably be best to answer this, as some of those federal dollars get funneled down. I think some of what we're talking about would fall in the planning section and not the infrastructure section. And so a certain amount of dollars will be funneled through for planning and then a certain amount for the infrastructure build out. And Alyssa's probably the best one to describe that.
Sure, the planning grants to each state are $5 million. And sort of like Andy just alluded to, any underspend goes towards your infrastructure. And then there's a $5 million for broadband and $1 million, or actually it's $952,000 for digital equity planning. I would maybe just add the additional comment that a lot of the discussion I'm hearing are the types of systems and relationships that probably would need to be sustained outside of the development of a one-year plan. So while I think that those funds are important, they're limited, they're very time limited. And certainly what I'm hearing from the task force are things about much longer term systems. So.
Thank you, Alyssa. Andy?
Yeah, I think that's a great comment. If we are going to create some sort of dashboard or some system to track this, we better figure out how we're going to fund this and staff this to move that forward. I think that's a great comment. Otherwise, we create something and it just dies, or it's such a cumbersome thing for the local community / providers to provide the data and make it useful. I mean, that should be really something we're thinking about for sure.
And then I think that really then lifts up the part about getting the philanthropic sector to the table, right? Because although we're building this out, there needs to be an understanding of what this looks like post that planning period, right? So that's a really excellent point to be put inside of all of this.
Mhm.
So again, that was in the comment section.
Mhm.
I'm also thinking down on 13, where it's identifying all the state organizational agencies that are involved and the different organizations, because that then becomes the future holders of this work as well, right? One of the conversations that's happening in other states is actually about the expansion of broadband workforce, right? And so we haven't necessarily had this conversation in the task force, and I haven't heard anything from DWD about this,
Mhm.
but we do need to have some centralization place for this, knowing there's a time frame, knowing there's a short time frame for some of the funding to align work that's happening already. Funders who are on the sidelines, I think it's just it's a moment where a lot of again, that system piece, the toolkit piece, but I think the leadership of this drive need to also understand the longer trajectory, even in the absence of funding in the future, and working to fill in the gaps.
Alyssa, the time frame on, you said something about a 1 year, but the time frame on the community planning dollars that are coming through, what's the expenditure time on that? The planning dollars from the feds.
1 year, 1 year for BEAD, and no, 270 days, I'm sorry, 9 months. And 1 year for digital equity. So very quick.
That also then says to me, hey, we've got to really plan out a big role, a massive build out really fast. What are the existing resources that can be ramped up really fast? What does it look like afterwards? Yeah, I really think that we would really behoove us to articulate some of that, especially in the narrative on this piece. So, yeah.
And that all ties to communities really knowing their needs and having engaged in these conversations already and have planning underway so that when the funding that is available, that they've already got that piece in place. So they're ready to take advantage of and apply for funding.
Alyssa, I know you probably can't give certainty on this because NTIA has to approve it. When do you think that planning 9 months will start? What are you hoping will happen?
I believe that it's due from the state to NTIA by August 15th, and they are anticipating a start date of within 60 days that they would review your application and approve it. So, and it's kind of new to everybody, so I don't know exactly what anticipate means in that language, but so I think you can imagine October.
Okay.
That feels really quick. So, all right, given that information, that idea, what in this list of recommendations, does that change how we might prioritize? Does that affect resources that we might want to imagine are developed quickly? Does that, what are your reactions in the context of the recommendations for this report?
We need to fund technical assistance on a level that we've never seen before, period.
So there is a comment in the comment section. It's highlighted or it's preceded in orange. It says, I think, make a rec ? Funding should be made available to existing organizations, schools, libraries, UW Extension, economic development organizations, nonprofits and community organizations, that have trusted relationships. Do we want to move that up? Does the task force want to move that up in 2 recommendations? Perhaps, okay. I'm gonna highlight this here. Other reactions that we'd have, going back over the list, what might seem that it could help us get to the point that if and when there is a call for applications that we could be ready to go.
Can I just add a clarifying point, just in case I have added panic into anybody's mind? The 270 days is when the state, after the planning funding is released, the state has 270 days to submit a 5-year action plan. In theory, the first step of that action plan could be, we want to do technical assistance grants to communities, or so I don't want to make people feel like those 270 days are it. It's just another planning date. And so I just want to be clear that in theory, that those aren't the only planning dollars, and that's not the only, like they could say this, the plan could say ongoing technical assistance as we spend BEAD dollars. So it's just the really specific, use it to create your plan dollars is time limited.
So you're talking the plan that the state is submitting, and you have already made this, Wisconsin has already made an application to get those dollars.
Wisconsin has submitted a letter of intent.
A letter of intent.
Dollars.
Okay. But we have a longer period of time. When you said 1 year, I'm like, I didn't get 1 year to execute. Right. I was beginning to panic.
So we can all take the pressure off the room. But I do think, I think that was also a feeling throughout this this round of the task force as well, which is, we know the infrastructure law is offering certain things. This group, obviously everything is emerging. So knowing some of that timeline does help make that decision process. but I think it also colors the recommendations. Is it funding ongoing technical assistance? And for the length that is allowable, which I'm hoping is closer to the 5 years of the bead work, right? So I think that is really, we do need to make sure that that informs some of the decision making on some of these policy recommendations.
Gail.
And to go along with Brittany's, I think that continual in the 5-year, I know, Sal and other people had talked about not all communities are at the same place right away. And some of our communities are successful. You've had partnerships with our providers and are moving forward and just need, some help getting to the next to access some of those federal funds. But some are at the very beginning asking those questions of who do I invite to the table? So I think putting in that's a continual process as long as, our funds are available, because all of our communities aren't going to be there right away. And it's going to take time to move those from some of those community groups to the more regional to help connect all those dots that we were talking about before. And that's going to take some time, and building trust, especially as we work with those tribal communities, that takes longer. You have to develop the trust first before you ever get to the project.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you, Gail. So if we are ready, and we can move up to the narrative, and if you identify as we're going through the narrative things that should be collapsed or refined or changed, that can come into this conversation too. But if we go up to the questions and the prompts and the narrative, let's maybe think about what are some of the anticipated results of the recommendations? What measurable items, as we did with networks, are we looking for to be able to assess whether or not we've been successful? What ways are the current landscape? Is it affecting, is it shaping the recommendations? And maybe let's stick with measurement and anticipated results of recommendation, and maybe a little bit on landscape, and then we'll come back to what are key concerns that need to be raised yet. So what measurable outcomes, or what are our indicators of success? Maybe not measurable outcomes, but as we're making progress along the way, what are our indicators of success, things that we should be looking for?
So this is related to how I see this as, the supportive system versus the toolkits to be accessed and the technical assistance between that. But clearly you can measure how many communities have gone through training, right? And so, documenting that, keeping an eye on that, tracking success in grant applications, post work. It is ongoing support. That's much longer than 6 months. Ask anyone who does community development. And so there should be some sort of way to have a clearinghouse for common issues that are arising, and making sure that the resources are then pressed in those areas. So I think there's a program management capacity that's attached to watching communities use the dashboard. You can truly, it's digital, you can track usage, who's using it. I think there's a lot of pieces inside of that could be measurable.
Thank you, Brittany. Other indicators, measurable outcomes or measurable stops along the way to success?
with the how-to guide, there would be examples of communications, examples of, sorry, I'm thinking as I'm talking, examples of the communications, the planning documentation, the types of meetings, how often, and that kind of thing that are recommended. And then perhaps a metric of who has used the how-to guide, or how many times it's been downloaded, or which groups are engaging with that.
Thank you, Rachel. Other thoughts, other ideas? How about a different question? In what ways or how has the current landscape shaped our recommendations? This may help the PSC as they're writing the report. So what are some of the, as we were making recommendations, as you were making recommendations as a task force, as you've been evaluating them, what is kind of the current environment and landscape, kind of how has it informed what we're recommending?
Well, I think the fact that we're seeing community planning, we're seeing planning dollars. That's a huge thing as that's being funneled down, the equity, digital equity dollars. I think that, and of course the access, but the planning and equity are something that's we haven't been funding before, right? We want people to go out and build infrastructure, but we haven't prepared them to go and do that. So I think that's really helped us look at the networking portion and the tools portion to help us shape and say, well, let's take advantage of this. So we're prepared to make the best use of our dollars when it comes to infrastructure.
Along with that, Gail, maybe it would include the supports for communities with fundraising and braiding together different funds and raising matching funds.
You're right. And I think that goes to Brittany's point about also looking at philanthropy and how do we take it to the next step? We know all these dollars are going to be there, but they're only going to be there for so long. And I think Alyssa said that. So what happens after that? And so that gets into how do we develop what Rachel's talking about and what Brittany's talking about so we can fund those for the future.
And just for explanation for the public that's reading it, certainly this round of the task force is informed by the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law, right? So we were working inside the time frame that the decisions about what it would look like, this unprecedented investment into broadband deployment and the usage of it locally, right? So that's certainly coloring how we're trying to make decisions in real time as the guidance is coming down, right? So we'll have to articulate how the NOFO isn't being released, in the month of May is informing something that is being turned in June. Because I think there's so much that's connected to that, but I think there was a real strong reason for why we spent this time frame looking at the community and human network that needs to be put in place for the organizations and the ISPs to work together in a way that they haven't had to before. Well, they have been, but it's just kind of amplified. And so that certainly needs to be part of the landscape laying.
Other comments? Questions? Things that we would like to highlight? If we were to, we've had some case studies in policy. We've touched briefly on a couple of examples for network. Are there any specific case studies that we should look at amongst those that we've already recommended that might be really good examples of resources? Or are there others that we haven't mentioned that we could be using to draw on as we're working towards writing this report? So case studies that might be great exemplars of resources and the good use of resources.
Kristen, I think the example that I shared before from the Department of Public Instruction, working with different school districts and community connections, could also fall very well under resources if there are others for networking.
And I would say the same thing with the extension curriculum for community planning. It would be the same thing. It could go in networking or it could fall under resources.
Wondering if we have maybe, those two and maybe one or two other case studies that really are just kind of best practices overall, where we can say this is a way of doing things that has really hit on all three of the elements that we've talked about. Because yes, you could definitely pull out both network and resources from both of those.
I think the Brown County mapping is an example of, using a tool for planning that, and, it's long range planning, and some of what's come out of that would be a great how-to.
Other cases that we should be thinking of or keeping in mind?
You could use our partnership that with the Menominee tribe when we built our, using CARES Act dollars in a matter of months, because we were up against the deadline of December 31st, 2020, as a case study, if you'd like.
Celeste, would that go here or in resources, or would it go in a good example of networking, how you worked with the tribe?
Probably networking, you're right.
Yeah, I think it's a good example. I'm just trying to figure out the best place to put it in the report. And I think a tribal example would be excellent.
Yep.
I have a question for our ISP folks. As we look at the resources section, there are a few places that ISPs are mentioned. One where I'm seeing, where it talks about mapping and that it would be valuable, for the ISPs. But are there other resources? I don't want to miss resources in this section that are important to ISPs that aren't, a recommendation. And I know we don't have a lot of ISPs on today, but Jean and Celeste and Lori, anybody who could speak to that, I just want to make sure we're very cognizant of the needs of them as well.
I can share, and I don't know if this fits what you're asking, but one of the things that we rely heavily on when we are planning new deployments is county GIS maps. And they vary from incredibly fabulous and useful, and every positive adjective I can give them, to almost nothing. So I don't know what recommendation I would make to the governor about that, or to the, for policy making or anything like that. But that is just one example of something that would be very, very helpful if it were more equal all
So
over.
would that kind, I'm looking at where that might, I know geo software is one thing, but it also where I know geo software folks are partnering with local GIS folks. If that could be some, I'm just thinking out loud, but I see what you're saying, Lori, and I think
Yeah, and
that would be a
I'll
good.
bet Andy would have something to share on that too.
His hand up.
Oh, perfect.
That's right. I got to defend the mapping folks. No, I mean, I think that if we can come, we can reach out to the mapping community through the county land information offices, and we could probably come up with some layers. Like I said, there are some existing layers statewide, but some things that are easily put together. Some things will take a little effort, take a little funding and different things like that. And again, got to take into account how that's going to be maintained and put together. But I think there are some base layers that we can put together statewide that make some sense, that benefit not only the locals that are doing the planning, but the providers and everything, and can be together. I've had some talks with Coulter about this. I mean, I think he's got some good ideas, and I think his concerns too is who would do it, who maintain it, how does it get all funded, how does it all get put together, how does it get distributed out to make it make sense for people. But all that can be done with a little organization and a little bit of funding and some planning to put that together. And I think, that would be where I would start, again, try to figure out how much of a priority that is. We could probably give you some general prices on some of the stuff that's real easy and almost free to put together. And then the other stuff that gets together, because when I talked with Coulter, he was really going down the rabbit hole. I said, well, Coulter, that would all be great, but how are we ever going to afford that and do that, right? This big broadband fabric to have everything that we could know everything about everything. And there are some commercial providers that also have some data. I don't know how good it is and how much it costs to subscribe to that kind of stuff that's out there. But I would start with some of the local data. I'll agree with the comments. I mean, you got varying levels in some rural counties that have some very fantastic stuff to even, some urban counties that has questionable data. And so you got to kind of organize that and put that stuff together to make sense. And, we're doing some of that stuff right now for Next Gen 911 already. And some of that data would relate directly to this too, address data and good center lines and things and ownership and things that are probably important to things like this.
Coulter.
That's all I got.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Coulter put his hand up. I think he's got something to add.
I'm only making a brief appearance because I'm not a member of the task force here, but Andy's by and large very much right here. And yes, I know there's a pile of data that would be nice to have, but really to start accomplishing goals like that, it is a matter of, like Andy said, combining it with other initiatives and doing that right balance of getting what we need the most combined with what's the low-hanging fruit that we can use without spending tons of money or while collaborating with other business initiatives. Next Gen 911, which Andy's pretty darn familiar with as well, is a big, we'll say, cousin business issue to broadband. And to the extent that we can leverage these sorts of things, I mean, ideally, broadband can use other business areas to help build up its GIS data situation, and broadband works inversely and supports other business areas in the state with mapping data also. And really kind of cobbling those partnerships together is the only realistic way we're going to get stuff done here. And yes, there's a lot to do.
Gail.
I think that goes, back to what we were talking and then was on, I think, the comments section about understanding how all the dots are connected between those agencies, because the 911 system, and I heard workforce development, and I heard, economic development, and how we understand all of those and how they touch the touch points with broadband. Once we do that, I think it'll help us fund some of those initiatives that we don't know how to fund them right now, because we don't know where those touch points are, that we should be combining those resources to get the most for our dollar.
And we've been on the mapping side, been really trying to be careful to set standards that are attainable and aren't pigeonholing those data sets into just for a next gen 911 system at the state. You know, that they can be used for voter registration, can be used for broadband, you know, and a few other things, because there are standards for that data for next gen 911. But there's other things we want to use that data for. We don't want to have multiple data sets that people are trying to maintain it if possible and try to make it work, you know?
Right. And I think the important thing is, how do the communities and the groups who need to utilize all those know where those touch points are and that data?
And I would then go to, this is a communications piece as well, right? So GIS at the county level is a perfect example, because there has been outreach to the land information officers about what's happening on the geo software side of things. And the question back from them is, how can we make this part of our oversight? And Andy's comment that they're trying to create flexible layers that are multi-purpose. That's a great point in the streamlining, but we can't do that without knowing as much about what is going on that relates. You know, we've just had a conversation about how the recommendations are interrelated. Well, a lot of the agency activities are interrelated as well. And so how do we understand how one impacts the other? How do we clarify those tools and resources? I think they're pretty heavy tasks, but I think there's ways with some of the new resources to do at least some of that work.
And we struggle with that because then project creep happens. There's different agencies or different people that have business needs. They're focused on their business needs, and it just gets to be really difficult, but we're trying our best.
I think back to the question that Gail asked about what might be missing from ISP's perspective. You know, there's a lot of stuff on the recommendations here, the 13 or 14, whatever we're at. My perspective is, it seems like I think ISPs are encompassed in a lot of these recommendations, but these are written from my perspective, more from the community planner perspective, saying this is what I need if I'm a community, not this is what I need if I'm an ISP. And so that's one, I guess, just for what it's worth, observation. The other thing I would say, like all of us were kind of talking about today, this fundamentally all boils down to resource issues, whether it's human, financial, time, because in a lot of cases, and I'll use myself as an example, I'm one person, I'm doing broadband outreach, but that's one teeny tiny part of my job. So I'm not full-time doing that. Somebody would have to make a decision to say, either we need another person to do this full-time, or hire an additional person, devote more of my time to it, whatever it might be, but it's a resource issue. So, I mean, we can make these recommendations, but until we address some of the underlying resource constraints, different communities are going to have different levels of success.
I agree with that. I do think time is essential, especially if we're going to if we're going to do this right. And it's not just for ISPs. I think that in many cases, I know in my communities need time in order to make decisions. So they need multiple meetings in order to make decisions. You know, they have committee meetings, and then they have to take it to the full board. And oftentimes they just don't have that ability to get it all done with the timeline that we're giving them.
Jean, I'm reflecting on something that you said in one of our earlier meetings, you know, so their middle mile is something that will probably impact Wisconsin to a certain degree, and how it's built out, and how certain ISPs are going to be interrelated inside of it. One of the resources that was mentioned is, like figuring out the sharing agreements, if that's possible, right? And to a certain degree, if the ISPs don't have the resources, like attorneys and things like that, to really focus on that, how does that get fixed? How does that get addressed? Right? And is it simply raising the issue of, if this is how it, if this is a potential future, this is what the ISPs are feeling that they need?
I'm not sure I have a good answer for that one. I really don't spend a lot of time dealing with middle mile stuff, so I'm not probably the best person to answer that.
I'm wondering, Lori, you had talked about, if you could access just some strands, maybe you could address that. Oh.
You're muted, Lori.
There we go. I missed the first part of that because my headphone died. Can you? Sorry.
Yeah, so I was just wondering about middle mile, and how, if there's a build out, it's going to impact, the state ISPs in some ways, and what are the resources that are needed to help. Obviously, the ISPs have, like we're talking about lack of, resources to kind of sit and address that. But you did mention during the policy piece, like what resources are like assistance would be necessary for that to be addressed?
One of the most beneficial things that could happen is just simply to have a map of all the middle mile in the state, kind of, sorry, culture, I keep coming back to mapping. But that's one thing. Now there are services that can provide that information as well, but even they are at the mercy of the ISPs or the companies that build middle mile, reporting all of that. And I don't know if this ties into anything, but it just off the top of my head, cost of middle mile varies so greatly from one part of the state to the other. So I don't know where that falls into anything, but it's just a comment I'll throw out there.
Mapping, clearly a resource across a lot of different areas of development and for a lot of different stakeholders. What else do we have that is in our list, but maybe not as prominent? That as we're looking at our list of recommendations, are there any other things in there that are sort of underpitched, I'd say, if we were making a sales pitch? We're not emphasizing enough how much we need them.
Going back to the ideal public-private partnership in number 8, I'm wondering if that needs to be more specific in terms of like the ideal public-private partnership contains A, B, C, D. What are the components of what makes an ideal public? Is it that the municipality provides, funding for the project at a certain level? Is it that the municipality, does some quid pro quo with permitting, rights of way, makes it easier to accelerate a project? What are the components in an ideal public-private partnership? And do we need to drill down on that more?
And I think, oops, Marta.
Yeah, so I think that's number 5, Jean. When I look at that, it says document the partnerships by identifying best practices from among the successful ones. So I see those two as being interrelated. If we're going to create the model, we need to glean the facts, the good qualities of the existing ones.
Okay.
Gail. Oh, you're on mute, Gail.
Sorry, I was looking at that ideal that Jean's talking about too. And is it ideal, or is it what's best for that community? And they have actually developed and entered into a partnership agreement that looks at rights and responsibilities. And so, because what's ideal for one community isn't necessarily going to be ideal for another community. So I think having some type of partnership agreement to that public-private partnership and defining the rights and responsibilities and looking not just at today, but down the road, that long range. So it's something that's sustainable, I think is important, because I think that's what we end up with is they don't have good understanding of what that partnership is. And then the project doesn't move forward because they can't get the permitting. They don't have they've built a tower in something that's not accessible because it's in the middle of a tribal land, or, you know, I think that instead of the word ideal might be looking at, you know, some type of an agreement that gets at rights and responsibilities.
Marta.
Yeah, just following up on Gail's comment, I feel like because communities are all different and those needs are going to be different, picking out, what were the pivotal things in certain types of communities that make things work. And I don't even know if you can collect them, because they're all going to be, snowflakes. Everything's going to be very, very different. I mean that word, just deal with me here. Without political ramifications, I'm talking about uniqueness, okay? So everything is going to be different in a different community. But if we could, somehow aggregate information from the successful places that said, in this area of, 10,000 people or whatever, the thing that mattered the most was this, this, and this. In this community, of 75,000 people, the things that made the project most successful were this, this, and this, and kind of aggregate, okay, what's the size of the community, what are the resources, the area served, and the things the communities identified as those cement. What were the glue in those communities that made their system work? I don't know. I mean, otherwise this thing could get really unwieldy. I'm just imagining how you would put it in a spreadsheet. And I think, yeah, we've got to find a simple way to sort of get to the meat of, you should be looking for these kinds of components or those kinds of relationships.
And how do you train those communities? It's through technical assistance.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that, in the first half of today in networking, we were talking about, having those solidified partnerships in a menu inside of whatever dashboard of resources are those examples, are, those partnership styles and capacities. But there has to be someone there to guide you through, especially in communities that are just embarking on this for the first time. And I think that's such an important piece inside of this, because we need to know it's not good enough just to create a playbook and slap it out there. There needs to be someone to help those communities who are just starting out, communities who've gotten a couple of grants underneath their belts and have never operated multiple $million grants at the same time and oversight. And then there needs to be an even higher level, which is just really, really strategic problem solving. And I think that that's been a community or a conversation on the technical assistance side of things for quite a while. And I think that's that public-private partnership issue will start to dissolve when people are learning.
Are you describing a broadband therapist?
No matter what, that phrase is going in the report.
I was going to say, I think I need one of those.
I love it. I love it. Gail.
I just lost my thought. Oh, I was in the narrative. I think in the narrative section, one of the things that as we talk about resources and technical assistance, I think we need to highlight the PSCs and workforce developments, call for technical assistance and the great need that communities said by the short amount of time and the large amount of applications. I think that really needs to go into setting the framework of how important it was. And I know they didn't have a formal report, but to pull out some of those lessons that they learned. And I think one of the big lessons was getting back to the time thing. It's not something that can be done in that 3-month period because it takes a long time to do that work and they're all at different places. But I think that helps frame that whole technical assistance conversation.
That's a very good point. That is excellent narrative material, attesting to the need. I am looking at the time and we have 7 minutes left on the clock. So unless we have anything that we need to address in the next couple of minutes, I will turn it back over to you, Brittany, if that's all right. And I believe we'll have public comment.
That's perfect. Kristen, thank you for guiding us for an extended 3 hours. Thank you, everyone who's still with us. And so just to reiterate and go through, some of the next steps. You got invitations to 2 task force members received invitations to 2 working sessions. So as this report is being written, if on the 10th or the 15th, you want to jump in and have conversations about where everything is, go ahead and do so. And so, we'll have that as an opportunity. Everyone who's a task force member has an opportunity to go into SharePoint and add their comments. It's really going to be like very, very fast and furious writing on so many different levels in the next couple of weeks. So, whatever you have that you want to say, please add it at that point. But we're certainly, rounding to the end of this this journey, as the millennials say. And so, thank you for all of your attention to this work. Thank you for your comments, especially. I think they're just very thoughtful. They're driven in a lot of experience, and that really is going to inform how the report is written. But I'm going to hand it over to Jaren for public comment at this point.
Thank you, Brittany. I would just also say if there are any SharePoint issues for task force members, please do feel free to reach out. I would hate for that to be a barrier. I know that sometimes, one more login is challenging or could be challenging. So please don't hesitate to reach out. I'd be happy to help you myself if I can, or connect you with our IT staff here. They can help you. But as Brittany said, we'll move into the public comment portion of this public meeting. So members of the public can go ahead and unmute and make a public comment. I would just ask that the public comment remain brief and also pertain to the subject of broadband access. So first call for any public comments. Second call for any public comments. And I'll go ahead and make a final call for any public comments. And also just note that we do take public comments on a rolling basis in a written format. So, and we've got directions on how to do so on our task force webpage, along with other meeting agendas and recordings and such. So I think that's it, Brittany. If you would like to adjourn us, I think we're ready to go.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for participating today, and we will certainly be in touch soon. Thank you, everyone.